All right, let's jump straight into this explainer, and we're going to start right in the middle of the action. Picture this. A man is just staring at a bush in the middle of the wilderness. It's completely engulfed in flames, but somehow it's not burning up. This is Moses, and out of this literally impossible fire, he's handed a terrifying assignment. He has to go confront the most powerful ruler on the planet and lead 2 million enslaved people to freedom. Moses, who, remember, is just a shepherd with a stutter, responds by asking a profound riddle. And honestly, it's a riddle that unlocks this entire ancient narrative.
He essentially asks God, okay, if they ask me what your name is, what exactly am I supposed to say? Now, to really get this, we have to understand that in the ancient world, a name wasn't just a label you slapped on someone, it was basically a detailed resume. A god's name told you exactly what they could do, what specific things they controlled, and most importantly, what they were going to be like when your life was completely falling apart. So Moses is really asking, what kind of God are you going to be when things get incredibly tough?
And this perfectly highlights the massive, stark contrast between the ancient world and the text we're looking at today. You see, ancient pagan gods were strictly tied to very limited geographical domains. The Egyptians had a god for the sun, a god for the river, a god for the dead, very specific jurisdictions. But the answer God gives Moses completely shatters that whole paradigm. He just says, I am. It's his massive, all-encompassing answer. He's not saying he's the god of a specific category. He's claiming to be existence itself.
But hold on, before we get back to Moses at the bush, we need to rewind and look at where this story actually begins. The very first name used for God in the Bible is Elohim. Now, grammatically, this is really interesting because it's a plural noun. Hebrew scholars call it a plural of majesty, which points to this deep, profound relational richness. What's absolutely incredible here is that before humanity even existed to need a single thing, this baseline name is hammered into the text 35 times in just the first chapter of Genesis. It's laying the groundwork, establishing this infinite creator who has absolute authority over absolutely everything.
Now here's where we start to see this fascinating crisis-first pattern emerge. Let's look at the name El Shaddai. This name is revealed to a guy named Abram when he is 99 years old. His wife Sarai is 89. They have quite literally run out of every single biological option to have a child. The name itself is rooted in the Hebrew word for breast, meaning the God who nourishes and is completely enough just from within himself. Think about that. God only reveals this specific name of total sufficiency in a moment of complete and utter human depletion. And these names just keep building, always in response to the specific human emergency happening right in that moment. Take El Elyon, for example, which means God Most High. This name shows up right after a massive, highly unlikely military victory. Abram just rescued a bunch of captives using only 300 men against a coalition of kings. He easily could have walked away from that thinking his own tactical genius won the day. But instead, this specific name is introduced right then and there to keep Abram's ego in check, reminding him that the God of the heights is the one who actually won that battle.
Okay, this brings us to what I think is one of the most profound tensions in the whole text. Enter Hagar. She's a pregnant, abused, and entirely invisible Egyptian slave who has run away into the harsh wilderness. She's not some powerful patriarch. She's not a military leader. Yet because God meets her right there in the dirt and makes her visible, she becomes the very first person in the entire Bible to give God a name. She calls him El Roi, the God who sees. He didn't just see her problem, he actually saw her.
Let's geek out on the linguistic connective tissue for a second and see how this builds. That Hebrew root word for seeing, which is ra, actually evolves over time. It starts with God seeing a discarded slave in the desert as El Roi. But later on, when Abraham is facing the impossible test of sacrificing his son Isaac, God sees ahead and provides a ram and a thicket before Abraham even gets to the top of the mountain. And so that specific place is named Yahweh Yireh, the God who provides, or literally the God who sees ahead.
Which brings us all the way back to that burning bush, the name Yahweh. It's derived from the Hebrew verb haya, meaning to be or to exist. So the crucial takeaway here is this: because God is existence itself, there's absolutely no situation, no matter how broken, how empty, or how dark, that he cannot enter. He isn't just one power competing among other powers. He's the very ground of being that everything else rests on. And it's from this foundational name that God builds an entire family of dynamic titles.
You've got to notice this pattern. God didn't just hand out dry theology textbooks to people sitting comfortably in armchairs. He introduced this rapid-fire matrix of dynamic, compound names that were perfectly tailored to very specific, desperate emergencies. Staring at bitter, poisonous water, he reveals Yahweh Rapha, the healer. Completely exhausted in the middle of a battle, he's Yahweh Nisi, the banner. Hiding for your life from oppressors, Yahweh Shalom.
watching your city literally burn to the ground in exile. He is Yahweh Shammah, meaning the Lord is there. Let's actually zoom in on one of those for a second. Yahweh Shalom. This specific name was given to a terrified farmer named Gideon. This guy was hiding in a wine press just to thresh his wheat so invading armies wouldn't steal it. He's petrified. Yet, God calls him a mighty warrior and gives him this name, which means completeness and wholeness. Nothing missing, nothing broken. What's so wild is that God's peace isn't a trophy he hands out after you win the victory. It's the solid, unshakable foundation he gives a frightened farmer before the battle even begins.
Then, of course, we have Yahweh Rohi, famously known from Psalm 23. The Lord is my shepherd. It is so easy for us to just read that as a quiet, serene little poem you hear at funerals. But we really have to reframe it. David was a shepherd who violently fought off literal lions and bears with his bare hands to protect his flock. When he calls God a shepherd, he is speaking from the gritty, lived experience of an active protector who stands squarely between the sheep and absolute destruction. It's not passive, it's an intensely active kind of care.
Now fast forward to the absolute darkest, most unfaithful days of the kingdom of Judah. The city is literally about to fall, and the prophet Jeremiah introduces this incredible name, Yahweh Sidkenu. It's actually a legal term for being acquitted and placed in right standing. Jeremiah was promising a kind of righteousness that wouldn't be earned by human performance or trying really hard to be moral, because honestly, the people had completely failed at that. Instead, it was going to be legally given to them as a free gift by a coming king.
All right, so this brings us to a massive pivot in our explainer. Up to this point in the Old Testament, everything we've seen features God seeing the crisis, providing for it, and acting on it, but somewhat from a distance or through a prophet or proxy. But this entire distance-closing arc culminates in the name Emmanuel, which means God with us. The cosmic creator from Genesis 1 literally steps out of the heavens, puts on human skin, breathes our dust, and enters the human crisis directly from the inside.
In John 1:14 captures this brilliantly. The Word became flesh and dwelt among us. That term, word, or logos, in Greek philosophy was understood as the rational principle that was holding the entire universe together. So the ultimate, almost impossible conclusion to all these ancient crisis names is the rational intelligence of the entire universe deciding to write himself directly into his own story as a living, breathing human being.
The actual Greek word used for dwelt there? It's eskenosin. It literally translates to pitched his tent or tabernacled. This creates such a brilliant visual link right across the text. The exact same God in the Old Testament who filled that wilderness tabernacle with fire and glory is the New Testament God who built a tent out of human flesh so he could literally move into our neighborhood. The distance is completely 100% gone.
So when Jesus steps onto the scene, he deliberately stands right in the temple courts and claims that entire Old Testament resume for himself. He says he is the Lamb of God. That's the ultimate provision on the mountain Yahweh Yireh promised. He calls himself the Good Shepherd. That's Yahweh Rohi, but taking it a step further by voluntarily walking right into the wolf's mouth. He is the bread of life, meant to permanently replace that temporary daily manna, and he's the light of the world, the true pillar of fire in the darkness.
To bring this whole thing full circle, we look at the very last book of the Bible, Revelation. There, Jesus claims the title of Alpha and Omega, the first and the last. And that takes us all the way back to Elohim in Genesis 1. What this proves is an unbroken, unchanging character, one that doesn't shift or drift as the centuries roll by. The God who created absolutely everything out of nothing is the exact same God who is waiting at the very end of the story.
So, we're going to end on a question today, and it's a crucial one. Which name meets you in your current crisis? Every single name we explored today was pulled directly out of a specific human emergency. If you are totally depleted right now, there is El Shaddai. If you feel completely invisible to the world, there is El Roi. I challenge you to look at your own exact point of desperation today and consider how this ancient text suggests that God has already revealed a specific, dynamic name designed to meet you right there, right in the middle of it.